Hello and welcome to the second of the Loch seminars linking Orkney's community heritage. Thank you to NILPS for providing the resources for this series of talks. I'm Rebecca Marr, and together with Jenkins we are going to be talking about using community heritage and museum collections in creative ways to engage with audiences. We have come to these projects as creative practitioners, mainly working as artists in heritage settings. There will be some crossover with Katie's presentation, as both of these talks are about engaging audiences. We have provided an information sheet with links to the projects we'll be talking about today, so that you can look at particular projects in more detail later. I'm now going to hand over to Mark.
Many of you will already be working in creative ways, and we've been fortunate to work with some really inspiring collections across Orkney. The diagram here tries to explain our method of process when we're managing a project. It always starts with one of two things: the collection or community engagement. Collections can include artefacts, images, audio, music. Community engagement is about involving participants in a meaningful way. That can sometimes be in the design of a project, in the process, and in the outcome. Central to this way of working is the creative process. It's about working creatively with the community and with the collections. We think it's a good idea to use a creative practitioner, as they will often bring an outside view, a different way of seeing, and a new interpretation of collections. This usually results in new audiences engaging with not only the output from the project, but also new audiences then being drawn towards the original collections connected with the project. I'll hand back to Rebecca now, and I'll be back a little bit later in the presentation.
We will be travelling around some of the islands and around the mainland in this presentation. We'll start here in Hoy, a fairly dramatic location for the Heritage Centre here at the foot of Ward Hill. It would be interesting to link up the Ward Hills across the islands in some sort of joint exhibition, one for the future perhaps. Like many of you, their collection in Hoy has grown organically, meaning that it has built up as people have donated images and stories and artefacts. So the collection there has a wonderfully random feel, moving this way and that depending on people's interests. Noting that there was a gap in recent history and images from the 1960s onwards, there was a drive to cover that period, but apart from a few such interventions, it is largely responsive to what comes in. The main community engagement in the Hoy Heritage Centre is through events. This has been a popular and creative way of responding to collections. Typically, a focus will be suggested by something that has come into the collection, and that will generate a social evening of talks. There are main exhibitions each year highlighting an aspect of the collection. Heritage nights are held in the autumn, usually with food, and these are very local evenings. The rest of the programming over summer is made with locals and visitors in mind, and in connection with other organisations, such as the festivals. Events programming can be a very creative process, and clustering events on the theme of the exhibition has been a creative way that Hoy has used. For example, the Hoy Max exhibition, celebrating Peter Maxwell Davies's Rackwick years, included writing by Peer Arts Centre curator Andrew Parkinson on Hoy's influence on artists, and also included archaeologist Dan Lee of Orca's lead walk through the valley, taking it into the landscape that had informed Max's music at that time. This approach of travelling through time, be it across decades or centuries, is something that Dan as a creative archaeologist has brought. It also allows the Hoy Heritage Centre to think beyond the building into the landscape. Hoy collaborated with St Magnus Festival that year, and the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland performed Lullaby for Lucy, written to commemorate the birth of a Rackwick child. This event really brought that recent history home. The sheet music that was part of an exhibition was suddenly swelling the room. This recording now sits in the collection, bringing that full circle from responding to the collection to a creative output that then becomes part of the collection. Going back to the collaboration with Dan Lee the archaeologist, His use of archive photographs and updating them in community walkover survey days generated a series of then and now images, which is continually popular and engages people. This is used on the website with a slider application, which allows the viewer to move between time. We call this the Rackwick backflip. Many of you will have worked with then and now photographs, and it is a creative engagement to be recreating archive photographs and thinking about exactly where that photographer stood years ago, and to try and look through their eyes now and see those changes. Now moving to the Gunny Moberg archive. That archive consisted of a huge collection of material to be digitised. While that backroom process was going on, there was a desire to engage the public in the work of the photographer Gunny Moberg and raise awareness of this remarkable collection, as well as engage volunteers to work on the digitisation. Public events like open days raised awareness, but also allowed a channel for the community to add to the collection with information they had about the photographs. Public engagement was also achieved through mini exhibitions throughout the 2-year project. This allowed the archive to keep public interest and celebrate the artist's work. Oftentimes, these were very small exhibitions, sometimes a focus on only 3 images at a time, and these would be on a theme such as circles here, and sometimes using material from the wider archives at Orkney Library and Archives, where the Gunny Moberg archive is held. Material was selected which held a connection with the photographs and gave the images another level of interpretation. This process of curation and exhibition is a creative one. How works are presented, hung and interpreted are all highly creative activities. Exhibitions were supported by a small photocopied single A4 sheet folded several times into a sort of mini exhibition catalogue. This meant people could take the show with them, and it also allowed for another creative approach. Handing that creativity over to another group was a valuable project in itself. Here, art students make new work in response, creating a sort of conversation with the collection. Mounted onto foam board, this made an easily transportable show, and after Sandy McEwen saw it in the library in Kirkwall, she asked if it could tour to Westray, which it did. Working with schools can be a creative engagement. Here, Gunny Moberg's photographs are used as prompts for pupils to discuss the work and how they can apply it to their own lives, making a collection relevant. Sandy School used a selection of the photographs as starting points for a writing competition. This image of Stromness Shopping Week, with the Shopping Week Queen, the bonniest baby and the best pet, was lost on some unfamiliar with the event, but this didn't stop the photograph having meaning. The stories accompanying this photograph, written by the pupils, were inventive and creative, with one pupil's story talking about a minister turning into a goose at the wedding, and another where the bride was marrying the goose. Again, this made the photographs relevant to people themselves. A poem by Ebony, a Primary 2 pupil, shows a real engagement with the photograph and a very creative response. This became part of the collection. I'll leave you a minute to read it. Now another project. The collection used in the Stromness Hometown audio project was archive audio material from Orkney Library and Archive, and also a photographic collection held at Stromness Museum. The engagement was to involve the community in developing an audio tour of the town that would lead to the museum. The tour took in 8 stops, and at each site a layered history of the place was told through archive and new recordings. The workshops kicked off during Stromness Shopping Week, making the most of this town-centred time and when people had time off to enjoy the town and when they were open to happenings. New recordings were made, including some made with herring girls from the local drama club who were interviewed in character. The audios were edited in open sessions over a number of weeks, and the narration was voiced up by young people. The creative process here was a busy, ambitious one, relying on lots of different elements. The product was an audio that allowed the listener, whether physically in the street or at home, to immerse themselves in space and time, hearing voices of the past and present interwoven. People were able to pick up a headset at the museum and take the tour. Nowadays, it is downloaded onto people's phones. A DVD of the audio was produced, which used museum objects that related to the stories as visuals, connecting it all back to the museum collection. The Stromness hometown audio didn't date as you might have thought it would, and although the young people who voiced up the narration are all grown up now, the through space and time approach has allowed the project a certain timeless quality. In fact, the whole project was recently revisited in a Stromness Museum project with school pupils designing murals and the creation of a We Love Stromness website which traces businesses and shops through time, such as Flett's Butchers, which has an unbroken use of the premises since the business was started in 1876 by Adam Flett when he returned from Canada after working for the Hudson Bay Company. Flett and John Park inhabit the same space, John Park here in 2018 and Adam Flett back in 1890. Another Stromness Museum project focused on the heritage of the town was the Listening to the Piers project. This was a multidisciplinary series of events looking to draw the community's attention to the heritage and plight of the town's piers. The product, presented as a website, houses these multi-layered engagements with the piers. The process was a creative, multidisciplinary engagement. One element was the sharing of museum practices in the photographing of found objects around the piers. In this, we used museum photography as a way of elevating objects, treating them as we would museum objects. During simultaneous workshops, participants worked with archaeologists and museum staff to gather objects around the piers, cleaning them and then taking them into a makeshift studio to photograph them. Handing this process over to the public increased their engagement and embedded their involvement in the final product. The finders had their portraits taken in the makeshift studio, which was in the boat shed of a house neighbouring the museum, and that place itself was standing on a pier. And then they took museum-style photographs of the objects. These photographs were then displayed in the foyer of the museum in a temporary exhibition and in permanent display on the website. School pupils were involved in making recordings about what happens around the piers. Other elements were low-tide walks along the piers with photographers and drawing workshops. Artist Diana Leslie created a map of the piers, and this was painted on the seating area in the museum vestibule. In another project, the way into the collection was through one of the early founders of the museum, Reverend Charles Clouston. This Victorian polymath was recording many aspects of natural history, including weather and seaweed. He even named a seaweed after him, following his discovery that there were two distinct types of seaweed that we know as tango. This archaic name of Laminaria cloustoni is now superseded by the more conventional naming structure of Laminaria hyperborea. I mention this as people, as well as objects, can sometimes be ways into collections. This connection with seaweed inspired a series of identification workshops where participants gathered seaweeds and photographed them under studio lights. This then became the Stromness Museum Seaweed Guide. Turning to a creative workshop using archive material, this PAPI project, Reimagining PAPI, was part of a series of climate change related events. Here the recycling was the recycling or reusing of archive photographs to reimagine alternative worlds where the archive photographs were collaged with material from old National Geographic and contemporary art and architecture magazines. The results were highly imaginative and now part of a permanent collection of artworks held by the community. A series of postcards was also made. This playful approach to archive material was both accessible and engaging, and the techniques were accessible to all ages. Another project using archive photography as the starting point was the Kirkwall THI project Look Up, initiated by the KGS Art Department. The aim was to engage KGS pupils in the built environment of the town and to encourage them to actively look at their surroundings. Pupils were introduced to the chemigram process, a photographic technique that uses darkroom chemistry. The project resulted in an exhibition and a book. That book is held in the Orkney Libraries and Archives Orkney Room, and so itself has become part of a collection. This project demonstrated to me how creative processes can allow participants into another way of viewing heritage, in this case as something to reflect back in their own artwork. Their responses in turn make us look differently at the heritage around us, noticing the shape of things and seeing something familiar in new ways. I'm now going to hand over to Mark, who will explore some projects that use heritage material in filmmaking.
This project I'm looking at here is called Investigations of a Hogboon Mound, and it was working with Ali Kia at Orkney. And the sort of engagement part of this was about working with children of the Summer Archaeology Club in Rousey, and latterly bringing their parents to the exhibition. So it was engaging children, but then also their parents as well. The collection we used is a little bit different for this. It's really folklore, which is like intangible culture, if you like. The creative process that we used was asking children to consider the possibility that hogboons exist, and if they did, how could it be proven archaeologically? We used Tom Muir to tell a folklore story, and then the survey and investigation that the children carried out was filmed in reportage style. Children also learned photography skills. Children documented their finds from the Hogboon Mound through photography and drawings. A film was produced and an exhibition was held showing the drawings and the finds together with a screening of the film. All the material was presented on a website. Another project here, Orkney Story Stack. This was an Orkney Library and Archive project run by Scottish Book Trust, and it was actually run across 5 national areas by Scottish Book Trust. The engagement was about working with communities to gather people's stories. There was another big aspect of it, which was why it was funded by the Scottish Government, and that was to enhance people's digital participation with access to iPads, audio recorders and digital editing tools. We used objects and images from Stromness Museum and Orkney Library and Archive to trigger memories and gather themes. And you can see on this flip chart here the amount of themes that people came up with is quite incredible. We taught narrative skills so that people could tell their stories in an engaging way. We also taught recording and editing skills so that they could produce an audio-visual film. What was produced was over 70 audio-visual films, and these were all deposited at Orkney Library and Archive. We also put on a celebratory event and an open day to engage with community and participants. Films from Orkney and the other 4 networks are all available online on the Scottish Book Trust website. The great thing about this project was that the iPad kits are available to loan from our libraries here, just like a book, free of charge. This is another project here, Pappy on Film, working with Pappy Development Trust, and I was commissioned to create a film about the cultural heritage of Pappy. We held a community open evening to gather people's ideas about the local heritage that they wanted to share and see preserved. We created themed tables to gather people's thoughts and stories. The collection I sourced was from Orkney Library and Archive and the Pappy archives, and that included audio, images and a small amount of moving image. I also conducted new audio interviews, new filming, and there was also new music made by James Watson. I produced, rather than 1 film, 7 films. There was so much material to work with, and that a little bit later grew to 8 films. And these premiered at the Kelp store in Pappy. And what was amazing about this was just seeing how many people turned out for this event. You're talking about an island of possibly 80 people, and I think we almost had every single person off the island that came to it. It was a great night. All the films are also available to view at the Kelp store. They're also online, and there was a DVD made for sale, and the film has been deposited at Orkney Library and Archive. Another project here, quite a bit older this one. It was a commission by the Peer Arts Centre, and it was for the Scapa Flow Landscape Partnership Scheme. And the commission was to create a film around themes of Scapa Flow. I engaged with various community groups across Orkney where I gathered volunteers to help crew the film production. I worked with collections at Orkney Library and Archive and mainly worked from 3 books: Scapa Flow, Sky Over Scapa and Bloody Orkney. And one of the main things that jumped out to me when I was creating this project was a sort of different slant on the usual story that Bloody Orkney portrays. I wanted to show another side of wartime Orkney, and one that rang true with my own experience of coming to Orkney, living here and making it my home. I wrote a script and I filmed around the coastline of Scapa Flow and also in the Cromarty Hall in St Margaret's Hope, which I used as a studio for interior filming. I just want to show you a couple of slides here that was a way that I used, directly from the archive and created characters from those images. And it's just a really sort of playful way of dealing with archives, I think. I engaged 33 local people as crew, actors and voiceover artists. The soundtrack was composed and played by Orcadian James Watson. I also set up an editing suite at the Peer Arts Centre for a week so that folk could come and see my process, and I took that opportunity to record people for the voiceover element of the film. I just love some of these images. They're just so crazy. You wouldn't believe that some of these images existed in the archive. It was such fun recreating them. What was produced was a 35-minute film, and it premiered at the Cromarty Hall in St Margaret's Hope, and it was a great evening. There was music played from the era of wartime era. We drank Scapa Special from jam jars, and James Watson, the composer, played at the event, and it segued beautifully into the actual film screening. There's also a 2-week screening at the Peer Arts Centre, and it played at various film festivals. I created a website for the project, which I used as a kind of a way of seeing my process, as well as a place to go back to see the final product. And the film was also deposited at Orkney Library and Archive. So looking back at our first slide, the collection and engagement brought into a creative process can result in a meaningful product, be that exhibition or event, film or website. And this can result in new audiences engaging with not only the output from the project, but also new audiences then being drawn towards the original collections.
Well, thanks again to NILPS for providing this platform, and thanks to you for tuning in, and we look forward to our discussion with you.